Howdy, folks. Welcome to another episode of the Preparedness Podcast, the podcast that brings you the best in preparedness information. You can find us online at thepreparednesspodcast.com. My name is Rob Hannes. I'm the host and founder of the show. You can reach me through the contact form on the website or directly by emailing me at rob@prepcast.info. It's been I think a couple weeks now since I put out a podcast. As I had mentioned in the past couple podcasts, I am backing off on the number of podcasts that I'm actually putting out because I'm trying to focus as much time as I can on the new book that's coming out. I'm trying to get it ready for publishing, and so that I can actually have physical copies ready by the end of April, because at the end of April I am actually giving a couple classes on EMP at a Prepper Expo that's happening in the area. This one will be April 26th through the April 28th at the Scottsdale 101 Shopping Center. It's called Prepperfest AZ Expo. If you want to find more information about the expo, you can go to prepperfestaz.com. The organizer, Tony Tangelos, asked me to speak and give the class on EMP, so I'm trying very hard to have not only the new preparedness capability checklist that I'm working on, but also trying to make available the EMP book in print form. Just to give you a quick update on the book itself, it's at the editor. I found a really great editor, and she is going through it and helping me make sure that it flows well and it reads right and stuff. And when that's done, I'll get it back and I will put the finishing touches on it, whip it up into the formats that it needs to be, and then basically ship it off to where the print on demand and the Kindle book is going to be. And so hoping to have all that ready to go sometime by middle to late April, because again, the expo is at the end of the month. So that's the update on the book. I would like to remind you that if you haven't gone to the website at thepreparednesspodcast.com, all the show notes for all the podcasts are there. So if you're looking for some of the list of the things I talk about or information, you'll find it there. Also, one of the features we have running is the Prepper News Watch. And this is a collection of daily news stories that have some interest for the prepper. If you have not signed up for the weekly news tips, I want to remind you to do that too. These are some great weekly news articles that come out that are expounding on different aspects of survival, little things that I generally don't talk about here on the podcast, but can be just as important. You'll find the sign-up form up on the website itself. And while you're there, do me a favor and take a look at the banners that we have in the sidebars and on the resource page. If there's anything that you were thinking about buying anyways, or if you have an interest in what they have, I would ask you to do me a favor and click on the banner through the site so that we get the credit, because that helps us pay for the costs and all the stuff that goes into this, and helps us keep putting the podcast out. Now, the topic I wanted to cover in this podcast is basically a prepper's view on what's happening in Cyprus. Just in a nutshell, the Cypriot banks have closed down, and they've been closed for, I think when I wrote this, it was 9 days. I think it's 10 days now, in order to prevent bank runs, because they needed to do some financial stuff behind the scenes, and they didn't want anybody to be able to run to the bank and take out all their money. Now, we're going to get into the hows and whys of this in just a bit, but if that happened here, if that happened to your bank, where you couldn't get access to your money, how do you eat and pay bills? How do you put gas in your vehicle? Do you continue to go to work? Have you given any thought to what happens when the financial system has broken down to a point where you can no longer get your money? And that's what we're going to be talking about, because this is currently what the Cypriots are fearing right now, and it's a total collapse of their banking system. What would you do? And I think it's important to take a look at this. This is one of those opportunities in the real world of something that's happening in the real world right now that you're not directly affected by, that you can look at and do a what if scenario on it. So what if this happened to you? And if you've listened to the podcast for any length of time, you know that I'm a big proponent of playing the what if game, because this is one of the ways that we can test our preps to make sure that we're prepared for those things that are thrown at us, whether it's an earthquake, a tornado, a hurricane, a job loss, a sudden broken leg that prevents you from being able to work, or even a bank collapse, or bank runs, or food shortages, or trucker strike, or gasoline shortages. I mean, these are all things that happen to people locally, close to us, as well as around the world. And I think by looking at what happens during these times is very important to make sure that we can strengthen our preparedness plan. Cyprus is this small island just south of Turkey, and they have a very troubled banking system, much like what the EU and Russia and China and the United States are going through. Now remember, nowadays the global financial system is all tied together. We don't have independent economies as much as we did, say, 50 years ago. They're much more tied together. So there is deeper issues here that may very well cascade through and affect your local economy, but we're not going to really talk about that so much. Cyprus is having problems. They need a bailout from the European Union or the EU. But in order to get the bailout, they needed to raise $7.5 billion. Now, they don't have $7.5 billion. I mean, the country, much like a lot of countries, is having massive economic problems. They don't have a finance system where they are living within their means. Like a lot of governments, they're spending far more than they're bringing in. And this is causing massive amounts of debt. Sound familiar, right? Okay, now to get this money that they needed in order to qualify for their EU bailout, they were thinking about having a confiscatory tax on all bank accounts, basically a one-time fee on all bank accounts, checking, savings, whatever you had in the banks in Cyprus. They were going to extract this fee. Now, they were going to take out more for the, quote, rich accounts and less for the less rich accounts, but basically everybody was going to get hosed. So they were going to wake up one day and simply just do this. Now, if they failed by letting the cat out of the bag that they were thinking about doing this, because once people learn, they get all irate and agitated, and they have riots and stuff. And so when their parliament voted on this, nobody wanted to have it, but it was too late. The damage is already done as far as credibility and stuff. And while they ended up not doing this, there's a lot of fallout that has been happening. And this gives us a look at it to a potential what-if scenario and how we would handle this. What if we had to go through the same thing? Now, what's happening is nobody can get to access to their money. All the banks are what they call a bank holiday, which is basically they shut it down and you're not allowed to get access to your money. Apparently, some of the ATMs are still working, but they're running out of cash, and it's not very consistent as to who can draw money out of those ATMs. So there's a lot of frustration that's going on right now. Now, in this country, Fed Chairman Ben Bernanke was asked if this is something that could happen in the United States, and he replied that it couldn't because we have the FDIC, which insures bank accounts. Now, FDIC stands for Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, which it's a corporation, so it tells me that it's not a government entity, so it's about as federal as Federal Express. But I have some issues with what Bernanke said, because the FDIC only insures up to $250,000 worth of deposits. So if they did confiscate money, I suppose the little guy might get his money back, but there's a limit as to how much the FDIC can cover. So if they had to cover everybody, they wouldn't have enough money. In fact, I seem to recall, and I probably should have done some more research on this, but I seem to recall that the FDIC has been bailed out themselves several times. So it isn't a panacea as far as, oh, everybody's insured. The other thing that I think is a problem is whether or not your money would be covered through or due to government confiscation or taxes or whatever they want to call it. Now, I mean, I thought about doing some deep research on this, but quite honestly, it wouldn't matter, because regardless of however it's written right now, if they were going to do this, they're going to do it anyways. They'll find whatever they need to do, however it needs to be done, whether they need to rewrite the laws or find a loophole, they're gonna do it. So my guess is since that everything in the government and the banking today is nothing but smoke and mirrors, we would either see the FDIC would not cover these government fees and will be SOL, which is sorry out of luck, or B, they're going to sell this idea saying that the FDIC will cover any confiscation within their limits, which is $250,000 or less. Now, granted, this would be 10% on $2.5 million in a bank account. But I think this would pacify most people, is because most of us don't have $2.5 million in the bank. And a lot of people, I think, would be okay with it because, oh, well, it's just another form of tax the rich scheme that we keep hearing over and over for the past, 8-10 years or whatever it is now. As the FDIC can't cover all of these losses, the federal government or the Fed will probably promise to infuse funds into the system to cover all these losses. In other words, it's just another shell game where they're calling it something different, but it'll be no different than another tax and print scheme where they continue to tax us, we the people, while printing more and more bogus money. Okay, so now back to Cyprus. The banking system of Cyprus and the Cypriot government has lost all credibility with the Cypriot people. This is the sort of thing that causes bank runs and credit shortages. Nobody wants to keep their money in a system that's failing, and people tend to not extend credit when they're not sure if they're going to be able to get paid back for that. So when bank runs start, people start looking at the currency with skepticism and doubt as to its solvency. Bank runs bring shortages of goods, fuel, food, medicine, and so on. Additionally, the lack of confidence in a currency can lead to utility shortages and other social services because people refuse to work for money that can't buy them anything. Now, this doesn't necessarily happen right away. First few days of a banking crisis, people try to continue as normal. It's only as the event continues for a longer period of time, what happens is that, for you, for example, would you go to work if the check that you were given at the end of the week, you weren't sure if you were going to be able to cash that? Now, you may do it for a couple weeks, but at some point you're being like, look, I haven't been able to cash the last 3 checks. I could go work for my Uncle Guido hauling dirt and at least make a couple bucks a day, which would be far better than nothing that I'm making here. So that starts to happen more and more the longer it goes on. Now, the truth is we're already being hit with something similar and have been for years. I've covered in past podcasts inflation and its evil twin, hyperinflation. Right now, we have interest rates that are at near zero. So any money that you have in banks is not making you much as far as a percentage return or a rate of return. If you're getting anything, certainly you're making less than what you're losing to inflation. Now, this allows bankers to use your money without having to pay you. In other words, you put money in the bank. Let's say you put $1,000 at the bank and you're getting a 1% return. The bankers can take that $1,000 and they can loan out, I think it's like 900 of that to somebody else and charge them 6% or 8%, depending on what type of loan it is. So they're making money on the loan. and they're paying you 1%, which is next to nothing. But inflation, even the extremely conservative numbers from the government of 3 to 4%, you're losing money. Heck, even if it was only 2%, you're still losing 1% value on your money. Now, I'll have a link to an article that talks about this more, but as the article points out, Cypriots were looking to lose about 10% all at once of what they had in the bank. But anybody that has had money in an American bank over the last 5 years or so, you've been losing 3 or 4% a year. So 10% is actually less than what you probably have lost by, keeping your money in banks. So even though we're not having a confiscatory tax put on our the money we have in a bank, inflation is eating away what we have in the bank as well as what we bring home for our work pay. That's what inflation does. The more inflation there is, if we don't make as much money, we have less value because we have left to spend, even though we're making the same amount. Just going to take a quick break for our first sponsor, and that's Legacy Foods at buyemergencyfoods.com. The people over at Legacy Foods are always looking at new products that they can bring out that serve the prepper need. And the latest thing that come out is storage food for pets. And right now they have dog and cat food, storage food that has a shelf life up to 10 years. And I think this is great because I know when I was looking at storing food for my dog, one of the issues I had is it was a chance of whether or not that food would go bad before I could get to use it. And so it had a high rotation rate. I could only keep 2, maybe 3 40-pound bags of food in rotation without running too big of a risk that I would have the food go bad because, it's not sealed for long-term storage. There is fat in there, and that fat can go rancid. And so by having, storage food for your animals, which to me I think are part of the family, not only do they provide comfort and a moral support, but they also can do work for you, whether it's taking out rodents and vermin and bugs, like what cats can do, but also protection as far as warning and even guard patrol. It's like guard dogs. So having storage food for your pets, I think is a great idea. You can find it at buyemergencyfoods.com. And if you call in your order and mention that you heard about them on the Preparedness podcast, you can get 5% off your entire order. That's buyemergencyfoods.com. Now, rolling to this next section, we're going to be talking about what-if scenario considerations. As a prepper, when you look at situations like what's happening in Cyprus, you need to be thinking about what happens if something like this occurred around you. The cause of a bank run and drop in confidence in the currency isn't the issue here, as there are many things that can cause that to happen. You need to look at the effects and what you can do to mitigate them. First, this announcement of the bank tax or levy occurred on Saturday morning. Now, I'm surprised that it didn't happen or they didn't announce it on Friday night, because this is typically when they make these sort of announcements, after the banks have closed. So, the lesson here is to expect the announcements of bank holidays to start on weekends. Take care of your bank transactions before Friday arrives, especially if you're going to be pulling money out of your accounts. Don't get into the habit of going, well, I need to go to the bank and get some money, but okay, I'm going to do it on the weekend when I got some more time, because that's the time when you're going to find that you're caught. The nearly 2-week-long bank holiday blocked people from getting to their money. When banks are in trouble, they close their doors. They call it a holiday. They do this so that you can't withdraw your money from your accounts. Why? Well, because they want your money for themselves. Banks do this because they have no concern for you or what is yours. They care nothing about whether you need to buy food or pay bills, or even if you need supplies for your baby. Quite honestly, bankers couldn't care less about any of that. To them, all money is theirs to do with whatever they want. If that wasn't true, then it would be massively illegal for banks to prevent you from getting to your money. In fact, the exact opposite is true. Bankers always pay themselves first and have a chronic habit of making bad loans with your money that causes them to perpetually be insolvent. The lesson here is that if you put your money into a bank, you need to have the expectation that you'll never see it again. This goes for safety deposit boxes too. Several years ago, I did a podcast that talked about the confiscation of safety deposit boxes by the governments for no reason whatsoever. This was during the recession when governments were in dire need of cash, and they went about getting it any way they could. Bank holidays are to prevent bank runs, which is what happens when everybody tries to withdraw their money from the bank at the same time. In the Cypriot case, this holiday was to freeze accounts so that the government could steal a portion of it. They had to close the banks before word leaked out, because once everybody learned what was going to happen, they would want to withdraw all their money, which means they wouldn't be able to tax that money. Bank runs can also happen when there's a currency devaluation or a massive loss of confidence in the money. When people suddenly realize that the buying power of cash is dropping rapidly, they're going to spend as much of it as they can buying tangible goods, because tangible goods retain value, while the fiat currency crumbles to nothing, to dust. Now, we've talked about this before in several podcasts. History tells us that all fiat currency, which is money that isn't backed by anything real, will eventually be debased to a point where it isn't worth a darn thing. So the lesson here is that hard assets and tangible goods are worth more than money itself. Another way of looking at this is that it's better to have food and water and ammunition and gun and gold and silver than it is to have cash, because when the buying power of that cash goes to zero or near zero, you're not going to be able to get anything with it. During bank holidays, credit and debit cards may or may not continue to work, and ATMs, if working, will quickly run out of money. Now, ATMs may still connect to the bank, but they could be out of cash, or they could have cash, but be unable to connect to your account to know whether or not they can give you any cash. This hardly matters, though, as businesses will quickly stop accepting credit and debit cards as checks and paper checks as well, as they're going to be fearful of not being able to collect the money from the bank. So what happens, if you're not aware, is when you use a debit or a credit card or even a paper check, that's an intermediary step between you and the vendor to get paid. The vendor accepts this note, which is a promise to pay, and they eventually collect from the bank. Well, if the bank closes and isn't giving out any money, or it goes insolvent, or say you write a personal check for food, and the grocer says, okay, I'll accept that check. Well, if they are unable to ever deposit that check and that bank never pays on your check, then they lose out. So vendors realize this very quickly, and chances are they're going to stop accepting everything except cash, which is why it quickly becomes a cash is king economy. However, even then, if you don't have exact change or simply overpay, you might not be able to buy. There were instances in Cyprus where business people basically refused to sell things to people because they were unable to make the exact change. If you're going to buy a bottle of water for $3 and all you have is a $20 bill, and the cashier says, I don't have $17, you either have to pay $20 for that bottle of water, or you have to go without. Now, without the ability to conduct commerce, as well as pay employees and buy inventory and pay suppliers, it's unlikely that you're going to be able to continue to buy things that you need. Things will become unavailable, or the people won't open the shop because there's nobody to work there, or the vendor will say, well, I'm going to keep all this for myself, or I'm going to keep it and I'm going to sell it out the back door on the black market, or to my friends and family, or what have you. As the bank holiday continues, basic needed items will start to disappear. There's also the potential for price gouging, which is where the vendors increase the price of goods because there's a shortage. Now, there's supposed to be laws to prevent this in some countries and states, but it happens anyways. It's really hard to prevent. In fact, the laws can only do something after the fact, after things get back to normal. There's nothing they can do during the event. So while you can say, hey, you can't charge me $20 for a bottle of water, it's not going to matter because you've got no teeth there. You're either going to pay it or move on. Okay, so there are 3 lessons that we can take away from this. Lesson number 1, not only do you need to have cash on hand at home, but you need to assume that you probably won't be able to get the supplies you need, even if you have the cash. Lesson number 2 is that you need to store food and other items that are likely to be unavailable during a money crisis. Lesson number 3, if you are a business owner, you need to be able to quickly switch to accepting cash and be able to make change. If you choose to accept checks or credit and debit cards, you run the risk of never collecting on that debt if the bank goes insolvent. Additionally, you need to understand that unless you are selling items that fill basic needs, people will probably stop buying from you eventually because they're going to be saving whatever money they have for the necessities, food, water, fuel, etc. Now, the banks and government in Cyprus are insolvent. They're in huge trouble. Somehow, they either need to rob Peter, the public, to pay Paul, the EU, or they're going to suffer a major collapse. Now, notice that the public gets the short end of the stick on this, regardless of which way they decide to try to solve this. Okay, so I want to make sure I'm clear on this, though, that this is not an isolated incident to Cyprus. Banks, all banks across the globe, all economies, all countries are at risk for the exact same thing. The reason is fiat currency. Fiat currency allows governments and bankers to spend far more than they can pay for. Now, though it's not prevalent in the media, there are riots occurring in Cyprus. People are angry, which is completely understandable when your government and banks conspire against you to steal, what is yours, to steal your money that you've worked hard for, you're going to be angry. That's what happens. The lesson here is to expect riots. And riots can lead to other types of lawlessness, and you need to be aware of it, and you need to be prepared for it. Now let's talk about fiat money. All fiat money collapses eventually. Real money that is backed by a stable index, such as gold or silver, doesn't have this problem. Unfortunately, most people today, particularly those that are under 50, have no idea what it's like to have real money, as bankers and governments have been slowly corrupting our money system for their own ends. Since 1968, our money has not been real money. Before that, the paper US dollar was a silver certificate. You could trade this at any bank for real silver. Yeah, real silver. In 1968, the laws were changed, and you could only get Federal Reserve notes for them. Now look at your paper money today. Now, I'm talking about United States money. I don't know about other countries' money. But if you look at any paper dollar bill in the United States, you're going to see that it says Federal Reserve Note. Now, a note is a promise to pay. Now, compare that to what our money used to be. And in the show notes that you're going to see on the website, I have a link to a 1953 $5 bill. The picture's up on Wikimedia. Now, notice when you look at this picture how it doesn't say note anywhere on it at all. It says that it, quote, certifies that there is on deposit in the Treasury of the United States of America $5 in silver payable to the bearer on demand. Holy cow. You will never see that on any Federal Reserve note because the FRN, Federal Reserve Note, is not backed by anything. There is nothing there other than the complete faith and confidence in the United States government, which, let's be honest, there isn't a whole lot of that lately. So this 1953 $5 bill that basically says you can trade it in for real silver on demand at any bank, that's real money. The stuff that we use now is a fraud. I know this sounds like a conspiracy theory, but it's the honest truth. You can go look at this at yourself. I actually own a $1 silver certificate. I have it in my my safe, and it's really awesome to look at because it looks a lot like this $5 bill from 1953 that basically says, yep, this is a representation of a certain amount of silver that's actually being held by the United States of America. It's real money. It's backed by something. We don't have that anymore. So what we have now is a fiat currency, which is just made up money. They can make it whatever they want. There's no backing there. There's no limit to how much they can produce, which, if you've been paying attention to anything that's been going on the internet and heard about the Bitcoin was created and designed to be the exact opposite. There can only be a very limited number of Bitcoins, and a new Bitcoin can only be created under very specific conditions, and it has something to do with prime numbers, I think. I'm not really sure, but they can't just print as much as they want. That makes the Bitcoin, even though it's a virtual currency, it can have real value because you can't just print as much as you want. You can't take a printer in your home office and start printing out 20s and take them around and start spending them, which is a lot like what the federal government and the Federal Reserve are doing with United States dollars. Okay, I didn't really want to get into a big, long lesson on fiat currency because I think we've covered this on past podcasts. But the lesson here is that if all fiat currency fails, then you need to make sure that you're not invested in fiat currencies. Food, fuel, survival gear, candles, gold, silver, farmland, all of these will still have value even after the currency collapses. So don't get caught holding more of this fiat currency, this money, than you can use. Now, this takes creative investing and creative ways to make sure that you're not holding on to. It's a risk to hold on to, whether it's in a savings account, which you would think is safe because it's being held for you in a very secure location, but it's actually, as we've talked about before, being eaten away by inflation. So it's really not doing you any good. You're actually losing value that way. This is actually a great point to talk about our second sponsor for the podcast, and that is flyingeaglegold.com. Just as we've been talking about, once you have stocked up on the basics of beans, bullets, and Band-Aids, don't forget to protect your financial assets with some gold and silver. As we just covered when talking about the United States dollar bills prior to 1968, they were backed by real silver. You could trade them. You could pay in silver or you could pay in dollar bills. Now, people carried paper because it's more convenient. It's lighter. It folds. I can put it in my pocket, and it doesn't weigh down my pants and stuff. That's why people carried paper. But the denomination or the real value was the silver. So when you get a point in your preps where you've got a lot of the bases covered, you've got a great preparedness plan, you've got a great evacuation plan, you've got enough food and water and stuff to take care of you. Now you need to take a look at how you can preserve the value of your savings during an inflationary or a hyperinflationary period of time, much like what we're going through now. You need to look at tangible goods. And I said on this podcast many times, gold and silver is a great place to store some of the wealth. Now, I wouldn't say put all your money there because I don't believe in absolutes. So I think that you can hedge your bets by taking some of your savings and putting them in gold and silver. And when you get to that point and you realize what gold and silver can do for you, I want you to give my friend Jeff Bennett a call at 855-289-7587. That's 855-BUY-SILVER, SLVR. Or you can go to flyingeaglegold.com and let him know that you heard about him on the Preparedness Podcast. The final part of this podcast are some quick observations about the event in Cyprus and how we can prepare for something like this. The events in Cyprus, I think, are a foreshadowing of things to come. I think the global economy is in shambles, and I think we're likely to see this happen in other countries. Hopefully it won't happen in your country, but I think the odds of it happening are pretty good. Preparing for these types of events is a lot like being prepared for other disasters. You still need food, shelter, warmth, clean water, safety, and so on. So if you're making a preparedness plan for disasters or crisis events, I think you're going to be pretty well prepared. The issue is now, like for Cyprus, they're the small, tiny island, and if their financial system goes belly up, I don't know how much food and water and other resources they have on the island itself. I'm guessing they have to import a lot, much like Hawaii does. So you definitely are going to want to look at those special considerations that you may want to pay closer attention to. If your area imports food and water and fuel and stuff, then you definitely are going to want to make sure you have plenty of those on hand. Otherwise, preparing for bank runs and bank failures is a lot like preparing for hyperinflation, as we are likely to see both in a hyperinflationary event. There are two time periods that you need to be concerned with, a short term and a long term. The short term is that time between when the banks close and when they reopen. Now, if the banks don't reopen, or if they're closed for an exceptionally long time, or if there's a complete monetary collapse of some kind, now you're looking at the long-term situation, and things are going to be quite different from when they were before. For short-term events, you really only need to worry about making it through to the other side. Hopefully, at that point, things start to return to normal. For long-term events, well, basically, anything can happen. I mean, you're talking about a collapse of the entire economy of your state, your country, wherever you live. Anything can happen. It's like a major disaster. If you look at things like what happened in Zimbabwe with the hyperinflation they had there, you're facing lack of social services and utilities, food shortages, fuel shortages. These are the things you can expect in a long-term bank crisis. It's probably obvious by now that one of the first things that you would need to do when preparing for a bank run or a bank crisis or a bank emergency is to make sure you have enough cash on hand. At the very least, you need to be able to buy items. And even if you're prepared, I would still take this cash and try to get what you want, because chances are that your cash is either going to be devalued, or you're going to have a currency change, or some other incident like this. The longer it goes on, the worse the event will probably be. But you also want to be able to pay your bills. If there are utilities and social services like garbage pickup and stuff running, you want to make sure that you can still pay for that, so you still have that service. Of course, the longer the bank crisis goes on, at some point, many of these needed items are no longer going to be available, and these are the items that you need to stock up first. Now, this is very much in line with preparing for any other type of disaster that we've talked about. So there isn't a whole lot to elaborate on this, but we still need the basics of food, water, fuel, etc. There's a lot of information that's coming out of Cyprus right now, and that's one of the benefits of living in an information age with the internet and stuff, is you can get a lot of up-to-the-minute information when events are happening. And as a prepper, we should take advantage of this information stream to learn what happens when these type of events happen. What happens in a catastrophic earthquake? What happens in a bank run crisis? What happens when there's a nuclear power plant destroyed by a tsunami and stuff? These are excellent times to take some time to write down notes as you're watching the news or listening to video and stuff like that. Take down points, key points to remember, so that you have them in your notes, so that when you need to go plan for this, you have something to fall back on. You're not trying to pull up all this information. Some of the best time to take notes is when it's happening, and your first reaction, because your gut reaction is usually the correct reaction, and you need to make a note of that so that when you go back and say, okay, now how do I prepare for this? How do I make sure this doesn't happen to my family? You can go back and you can consult your notes. That's all I have for this podcast. I want to thank you for downloading and taking a listen. You can reach me through the website at thepreparednesspodcast.com and on Facebook at facebook.com/preparednesspodcast. If you're on Twitter, you can follow us at Prepcast. And of course, you can always email me directly at rob@prepcast.info. And until next time, folks, enjoy life and be safe.